Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Sabattini, Principal Researcher at the Conference Board, and I want to welcome you to the September edition of Human Capital Watch. This is our monthly webcast where we feature content and research from the Conference Board's Human Capital Center. And today I'm very pleased to be here with a guest, Francine Parham, who I'm going to introduce in a second, and we are going to discuss making diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DI, part of the solution. And by solution, I mean solution to many crises that are happening right now across the world and organizations. Today, we're going to focus specifically on how organizations can create more effective strategies to advance women of color into senior leadership roles. We know that even among companies that have very effective D&I strategies that are wise, this is an area where many struggle and lag behind. So I'm very pleased to have Francine to bring her expertise and discuss some of the tactics that can be very helpful to drive the change. Of course, this is a very big topic, so we are not going to have time to cover everything. We're going to focus on a few selected areas of opportunity. And we're doing so by building on a recent report published by the Conference Board on this very topic. And Francine's example are going to help that content come alive. So again, really glad to have her here. So then what we are going to see in the next slide is some critical questions that we're going to be discussing today. First of all, why is it important to engage everyone in diversity, equity, and inclusion? This is, again, a great opportunity. We're going to discuss that in detail. It shouldn't be the work of one person, one function, one group. How can organizations really enhance participation in DI and make it everybody's business to advance DI goals and strategies? And how can we make leaders accountable? Another great topic. And building within this framework where they're going to focus specifically on how organizations and leaders can accelerate the progress among women of color. So before we get to all that, and I introduce Francine more properly, let me go through some really quick housekeeping and participation guideline for the webcast today. First of all, we encourage you to engage throughout the conversation that Francine and I will be having. We have a few polls for you, so watch out for those polls. And we are going to, and in the next slide, we also going to have some guidelines around getting credit for this webcast. So I will be monitoring the conversation. There's a comment chat box that you can see on the left-hand side of your screen. So feel free to jump in, comment, ask questions. We're going to try to answer to those questions as we go along, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the very end. You can download this presentation, and I encourage you to do so. You can see a PDF at the bottom of your screen as well. There's a link to the report that we're going to discuss, as well as other links that can be helpful for future events and other things that are happening in the Human Capital Center. So please feel free to download and save the information. If you're attending this live, as you saw on the previous screen, you can get credit, please, you can link at the link at the bottom of that says CU credit at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. So there's a lot of little places there, and you can get credit available for HRCI, SHRM, and CPE. Please note that you have to be online for the entire course of this webcast. And also, you have to respond to 3 pop-ups that are going to come up throughout the conversation. Last, housekeeping, there's going to be a brief evaluation at the end. Please take 2 minutes. This really helps us with making our programming better. So without further ado, Francine, and thank you for your patience there, I'm going to introduce you really quick. Francine Parham is an experienced HR practitioner, a social entrepreneur, author, journalist, public speaker, the list goes on. And Francine spent 2 decades in the corporate world, working in the human capital sector as global vice president in 2 Fortune 500 companies, and is now using this experience in working through learning and career advancement with an approach that I'm going to mention because it's going to come up later, that is unique in that integrates both individual skills as well as organizational barriers. And actually, that's how Francine and I met a couple of years ago when we were working on a project looking at these very issues. So your insights is going to be great as we talk about what organizations can do. You can find more information about Francine's work on the main page of the webcast, where there's a link to her bio. So as discussed before, I'm going to start actually with a very some context to our conversation. So before we get into the core of the conversation, I'm going to provide a background for the study that we're building on. So a couple of months ago, we published this report looking at why this is such an important time for organizations to make DEI a critical component of their recovery strategy. So this was related to COVID, but it really goes beyond COVID, as we'll see. So there are three main recommendations around this report include strengthening communication about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And here it's not just about the business case, it's really about definitions, about how you talk about these issues. And I'll get into that in detail a little in a bit. The second area of opportunity is integrating DEI in principal processes and activities across the organization. And the last but not least that I mentioned earlier that Francine and I are going to discuss later has to be about enhancing participation and making this everybody's business. So if I can step back a second and bear with me, you know, one of the things that we wanted to discuss today is why this is such a unique time to take action on these very strategies and these tactics. Well, first of all, with the turmoil that has been happening in the past several months, organizations are already having to revamp many of their processes and practices in human capital and in business, right? So whether we're talking about how you hire people, talent acquisition, whether we're talking about well-being or working remotely, returning to work, there's so many different things that are happening right now. And what a better, you know, what a unique time to take a step back and intentionally also integrating DEI into these processes that you're revamping. And we'll have a few examples, so, but that's really what makes it a really important time to think about these issues. And the second area is really the extent to which this topic and anything related to diversity, equity, and inclusion is top of mind across business leaders around the world, even those that maybe weren't thinking about this very strategically before. So we hear over and over from human capital and HR leaders that are asked, oh, can you put together a DEI strategy? Can you do this? Can you do that? So Francine and I are going to talk about this later as well, about so what are some of things to consider in addition to these very general guidelines on how to do so effectively. So I'm going to go through these three recommendations really quickly in a second. But first, we have a couple of poll questions for you. So we just put to work those that are listening to the webcast live. So we'll start with the first poll questions. And we'd like to understand, in your perspective, how effective is your organization's diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI strategy, to increase diverse representation in senior leadership roles? And we're going to give it a few seconds and see where it seems pretty even, and we're going to go over the results. Francine, it could be hopeful.
It could be. I'm seeing some progress here. It's looking good.
Yep.
And good morning to you, Laura, and everyone on the
line.
Oh,
good morning. Yes. Yes.
Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening. It depends on where
exactly,
we are.
wherever you're calling
yes, where you're coming from.
Exactly. So yes, welcome again. So let's close the first poll.
Okay.
And it's so as you can see, we have getting better. So, you know, we have a few people. We had which DEI strategy. So there's still a few people who may not have a strategy in place right now. It can be, or it's not effective. It's hit or miss. But you know, I'm hopeful that there's some getting better there. So maybe this. What do you think, Francine? It's a good opportunity again.
Absolutely, Laura. I mean, I'm encouraged to know this because as we'll talk, you know, this has been a long journey in the corporate world for some time. And so it's good to see that, we still have some more progress to make. There's no end game in this sometimes because the world evolves, but
Yeah.
I'm encouraged. I'm excited to have this conversation.
Yes, it's great. So let's see then, and we have a second poll questions before again we move along, and this is about what the top barriers. So but you may have a lot of barriers, but if you were to pick one that is really getting in the way of the effectiveness of your strategy, what are there? And we have, many different types. I know sometimes it might be difficult to pick one, but I'm sort of curious. And if any of you, just so you know, you pick that your strategy is 100% effective, we're going to call on you to do the podcast.
Yes, we want to know those. We want to know how you're doing it. All of
Yeah,
us
exactly,
want to know
exactly.
that.
We'll ask you
Absolutely.
to do a podcast on this.
Oh yeah.
So let's see. So, and again, we're going to close and discuss the results in a second. Let's give it a couple more seconds, and I see responses are still coming in.
I see there's the bar moving on the diverse representation and key decision-making roles, which we'll spend some time talking about as well, Laura.
Exactly. So let's close this one. It seems like most people have responded. As you can see, almost half see the issue as diverse representation in decision-making roles. So it's almost like a, what do you call it, chicken and egg issue, because you need a diversity strategy to get more people in those decisions. At the same time, that can create a barrier to the strategy moving forward. So what else? The integration into talent processes. I'm actually slightly surprised that the alignment with the business is not a little bit more bigger as a percentage. We hear a lot about that. Francine, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a piece where many organizations are aligned, but the next question becomes how are you aligned? And what specifically are you aligned on versus just the top level? So, some opportunity to dig into that, I think is important.
Great. Yeah. Anyways, thanks everyone for the participation. We're going to have a few more of these. So let's go back to the original list. And as I mentioned, this is all from the report that is linked in the PDF, so you'll be able to access this. I really want to just set the background and context, and I'm going to rush a little bit to get to the conversation with Francine. That is going to be the, again, the content come alive and the meat of our discussion today. So let's go back to the first tactic or strategy mentioned in the report, which is about strengthening communication. So a lot of times when we hear about communicating about D&I, people think about making the business case, which in some cases, it could be helpful for some organization, or it could be helpful, like if you have to make the case to, start a new program or to get budget for particular programs. But what we're talking about here is making sure that the communication is consistent within the organization, that there's a connection to the values and the business of the organization, that it becomes really part of that DNA, and that people know how and when to speak about D&I within their organization. So this may require, and we actually done some research recently looking at this, for organizations to step back and create even definitions or marketing campaign of sort to really highlight why this is important. And again, thinking of where we are right now and the visibility that DEI is having and the value of it during this time of crisis, this is a great opportunity to revamp your strategy that way. The second tactic is more operational, if you will. So in the next slide, we talk about, let's see, and I'm trying to think if I can move the deck myself. Having trouble. Let me try. Okay, here we go. Oh, here we go. It's functioning. Apologies, everyone. So enhanced participation into DEI. Actually, let me go back to that one deck. And of course, there's always the technical difficulty. Integrate DEI into principles, process, activities across the organization. So this might be programs that you already have in place. So we heard about many companies, for example, that have good ERGs already in place, and they use those ERGs to help during the crisis, right? To okay, an example that came to mind is that a company that had working parents ERGs, and we know that right now working parents are dealing with a lot of work-life issues, and so their ERG actually helped the company define a strategy to support working parents across the company. That's a very practical example. But there's a lot more, and there's programs and activities going on now that you may not think as D&I, but where D&I can have an important role. Well-being, safety, community building. So any activities that you are, this is really an opportunity to integrate those principles, those values, those definitions. And that is one way of making this everybody's business as the organization moves forward. And the last tactic coming from the report that we're going to again pick up later, speaking specifically about advancing women of color, has to do with participation. So unfortunately, what happens sometimes when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion is that the burden of making the change falls either on one leader, one person, or even on the groups that are underrepresented and beneficiary in the workplace. And so how do we make this everybody's business and make sure that everybody not only benefits, but also can see the value and participate? First of all, it's making sure that people know how to participate and they understand that they can do so. Some other tactics might be including diversity, equity, and inclusion elements into talent development, leadership development. Some of the skills that you and I are going to talk about in a while, Francine, how can you integrate those in how you develop talent within the organization? Use technology to make sure everybody's included. Look and make sure that information is shared equitably around the organization. This is another area where, now that many companies had to deal with an extensive number of people working remotely, they also had to rethink communication, right? So what a great opportunity to think about, okay, who gets what information when? And finally get feedback. So, and that's, again, the background, but I want to make sure that we take this information and now shift into the topic that we want to dwell into today. Francine, any comments? I just want to give you the opportunity.
Yes, no, thank you, Laura. I mean, I think that this last slide here is so important, and we'll talk more about that as you stated, or just the some of the barriers that we see. And I am the practitioner, right? At the end of the day, out here talking to many women of color, all individuals, and I cannot underscore this last slide that you have here around the participation of DE&I and really integrating that into your communication strategy, your talent strategy, your overall business operational strategy. Huge opportunity to really weave it into the fabric of an organization, because that's where the effectiveness occurs and can happen.
Yeah, it's just not a one-time thing.
No, this is the way of doing business. I like to say.
Exactly. And so we have our third part question that will take us to the topic. So the third part question is about how your organization is doing when it comes to women of color. So how much progress is the organization's DEI strategy making? And we're talking about the last year or so, right? And again, you may not have a DEI strategy at all. You may not, very little progress, some progress. As I said, this is an area where even organizations that do well struggle a lot of times. And a lot of progress can also depend, sometimes a lot of progress can be just some movement compared to, depends on what the starting point is, Francine. So we'll hear, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. We've talked about that a lot, Laura, but yes.
Yeah, so far I see that nobody's saying they're the best, and that's good to know, because we would call on you if you say that. So maybe we can give it a couple of more seconds and then close.
We're running pretty close with what the very slow progress to some progress. Which we'll share some, hopefully we'll be able to share some tips and insights and things like that exactly. The individuals can take back to their organizations.
Yeah, so let's close this so that you can all see the votes. As you can see, very slow. So, again, it's, there's no progress. It's 15% is pretty, It's still
That
pretty
that
high. I would like to
that
see
causes me to pause a little. Yes.
exactly, but it's good that there's some progress with the question. I'm also excited to see a 10% that says progress and two, a lot of progress. So that's great. And again, a lot of progress is relative to where you were before. But yes, this resonates. This is what we were talking about earlier, Francine, that it is an area where many organizations have to struggle, even when you have a very well um, developed, like women's initiative, for example.
Mm.
Sometimes it's difficult to really identify and address the unique barriers women of color may face.
Absolutely. So, in anyone that I see that there's at least two individuals where a lot of progress is been
Mm-hmm.
made, or is being made. So, by all means, please, share with us that are here.
Yeah,
I'm here to learn as well, always wanting to learn what those practices and things that you're doing in your
yeah,
organization to be confident in saying
yep.
that you're making a lot of progress. So, please share. I think there
Definitely
are two
reach out.
things. Yeah, please.
Exactly, either in the chat or reach out to us afterwards. Whatever you're comfortable.
Absolutely.
So as we can close the poll and go back to the deck. So and this is again, Francine. This is where I love to. Oops, nope. You see, all right, here we go. To so as we're gonna get into those tactics and some of the things you're seeing, but what are some initial thoughts that you'd like to share about why the progress is lower for women of color in your perspective?
I mean, I think, one of the things that we tend to do is it's sometimes we don't stratify as much as we should when we look at women of color. Okay. And so, first of all, we have that bucket where we talk about women in general. And then we have women of color, which is another subcategory. And even within that category, as we all know, there are women, there's African American, Black women, there's Latinas, there's Asian women. So, really taking the opportunity to look at the uniqueness sometimes that each one of those groups bring and the perspectives that they bring, that sometimes gets in the way. And, we're working in a very fast-paced environment. And, every day you wake up and, you're trying to move the business forward for those of you that are in organizations. And so it's very easy to have that kind of spread, if you will, in bucket. And I spent 2 decades in the corporate sector, so in my mind I was always bucketing, because I had things to achieve, and so that's how the business operates. So those that can definitely get in the way. I think also just acknowledgement, because a lot of times in organizations this is a tough conversation, right? It's a tough conversation to be able to have in your organization to say we aren't making enough progress. We need to look at this from a leadership perspective, not just a grassroots activity, and I'm very big on that. I think you spoke to that earlier, Laura, when you talked about the fact that you sometimes, and I'll use the word burden. You want to put the burden, or the ownership, I should say, on the marginalized group, and that can be challenging within itself. And step back and
Yeah,
get back to what you think is business. But
yeah,
this is the business. So those are some of the things that I see.
definitely, definitely. And I think that you're right. It's a tough balance because you have to. First of all, you want to include the voices of those marginalized, but you don't want them to take on all the work, right? So you
Correct.
have, sometimes I think the challenge is to give a voice, ensure participation, ensure that they have a say in decision making when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also that others participate and support the progress as well. Yes,
Right.
that's great.
And
So,
understanding, I'm sorry,
yeah.
Laura, go ahead. I
No,
was
no,
just,
go ahead.
no, I
Go
was just
back
going
there.
to say that this is, and understand that this is a very, this is a journey, obviously, but it takes a lot of dedication and it takes focus, and you can't take your eye off of this,
Mm-hmm.
because, 2 steps forward will have you make 4 steps backward.
Yep, yep, yep. We see that in diversity and inclusion all the time, definitely. And so, sorry that I rushed you here, but so one of the things that we're going to discuss now is start to think about specific barriers and tactics based on your experience and the work that you've been doing, Francine. and some discussions that you and I have had before, because we had these conversations a few times over coffee in
Many
person
times.
before this all exactly. And one of the things that you and I, discussed a lot because it's related to the work that we were doing
Yeah.
is the information sharing. And so I'll let you, take this on, but this is a really key topic and often gets doesn't get really integrated effectively in D&I, in my perspective.
I agree with you. And, this is how you and I met with, sharing the information as we talked about. And really, this is our life's work, trying to solve for this. But, at the end of the day, when I talk about the role of, information sharing, this goes beyond just the standard. And, as I said, I spent 2 years in 20, gosh, I took a zero off of that. I spent 2 decades in the corporate sector working for those organizations that you mentioned. And I truly understand the importance of information sharing. And I'm talking about beyond just the topical things. And so, how do you really truly share with individuals, especially, and we're speaking of women of color as well, how do you share with individuals and employees and those women about how do your systems, how do your processes truly work? We all have the standard, like, okay, let's talk about succession planning and let's talk a little bit about talent development. And I just use those as examples, but really sharing how the mechanics of that
Mm-hmm.
actually works. I participate in a lot of discussions. I actually have a summit that we're doing coming up in October. And I started this journey last year where I just got out on the road and started talking to women about what did they know, talking to women and women of color specifically about, do you truly understand, how the system works within your organization around your development. And I'm not
Mm-hmm.
talking about just the standard, kind of top line. Here's what it is and how often it's held. But do you understand who's in the room? Do you understand how they talk about you? And I encourage women to ensure that they're in the conversation. But here's the catch with that. In order for you to be in the conversation, you have to understand what the conversation is about.
Yep.
Okay. So I can have a great conversation with you and really not truly get to the essence of what
Mm-hmm.
I need to know, and
Yep.
really understand what is the processes. I tell women, just for
Mm-hmm.
example, I say, do you understand what the critical positions are in your
Yep.
organization? Do you understand what pipeline means? Are you in the pipeline? Are you in it or
Mm-hmm.
are you not in it? And they're like, wow, I don't know, Francine.
Yep.
So those are the things that gives me a signal
Yep.
to knowing that they don't have the critical information to what they need to do to hold the organization accountable. Because, see, when your employees hold you accountable, you in turn, as an organization, will start to be accountable.
Yep.
So,
Yeah.
the organization, huge barrier to this is really digging into that and really
Yeah.
helping, women and women of
Definitely.
color in particular understand
Yeah.
the
And
right
I see two
information.
opportunities there, Francine, as you were talking, because, we're talking about things that we often take for granted that may be invisible, right? So someone is in the know may not realize that not everybody's in the know. So maybe you're hearing
Mhm.
this, from your mentor. Maybe you have a mentor that is in the know, and you may not realize that others who do not access to that information,
Yeah.
or somebody, you were talking about sponsorship before. Okay, do you know how we're speaking about you? So
Mhm.
some people may not that they need a sponsor know that they need a sponsor to actually get particular assignment. They may not even know that it's an assignment that they need to be successful at that company, or what they need to do. And the way that I was thinking as you were talking is that it definitely is an opportunity for individual women and employees who are interested in advancement to figure out, but for leaders to want to be inclusive, to be very intentional about making sure that the information is shared equitable, and for organizations to also make sure that information is shared equitable. So that's kind of the dual opportunity. Yes, uh, you know, make sure, because that's uh, some of these things remain invisible largely, right?
Right. And things that we, don't think about as leaders. We are like, oh, everyone knows, in the beginning of the year, there's this process, or, we've asked you to complete your professional development, package or whatever you have your employees do. So you automatically think everyone understands that. And we know that you may understand it at the surface because you're participating in it as an employee, but do you really truly understand how it actually works? And
Mm-hmm.
that's where the organization, and you hit the nail on the head, and I always say this is a leadership imperative. So this is something that if you are a leader in the organization, I see it as your responsibility. I see it as your duty, not just to be involved in the conversation, but also help individuals understand what you are really talking about and how are you really assessing them. There's the assessment that's on paper, and then there's the other assessment, and that's where I talk to women and women of color around what I call the unwritten rules and the unspoken skills. Right?
Love it.
That's the stuff that's not on paper, but you got to have it because that's what you need in order to move
Mm-hmm.
forward as an executive or a senior leader or even on that management board. You got to demonstrate some of those things, and they're not on a piece of paper, I promise you.
Yep. And again, it's because they're remaining visible, and if
They're
you
invisible
are in the know, you're not going to
in the know.
realize that necessarily that others are not. So
Exactly.
this is all great examples, Francine, and so that actually relates to the next barriers related to folks' career pathing, and I love to hear your thoughts about this, and it's not only access to information but access to the actual opportunities. It can be
Right.
jobs or
Hmm.
assignments that are
Hmm.
critical to advancement.
Yeah, and it definitely ties to that. And once again, we underscore the importance of communication, but also communicating what the career paths look like, you know, and
Mm-hmm.
not only, it is obviously, I encourage women and women of color to clearly, ask that, to clearly listen, to clearly look out for those things, but also there's the duality again from the leadership perspective. And this also is where, that DE&I leader plays a huge role since we're talking about that and and we'll get to that later on as
Yep.
well. But this is where, really understanding what does it take. You read the announcements, right? You see them, you talk, you see the executive or whomever you aspire to be walking down the hallway, but really understanding what does it take to get there. And that is, really important to know because then I have the ability as the employee, as the woman of color, to make a decision, right? I have the opportunity to know that, this assignment is going to do this or this assignment is going to do that. And, I encourage women to, or any individual to ask when you're given, when not given, but when, they say, hey, Laura, we'd love for you to take this opportunity. The first thing you should say is, oh, why, thank you for thinking of me, right? But the second one should be, so tell me, what is this position preparing me for? Okay. See,
Mm-hmm.
I'm always focused on not the position that I'm getting, but the next position. Because obviously you think I'm great for the position that you're offering me, but I want to be prepared for that next one. So that's a part of the career path or career pathing, I should say, that organizations really have an opportunity to
Mm-hmm.
showcase, and to just really have that open dialogue about how did Laura get to this level? Let's talk about, the sponsorship she needs. Oh, let's go one step further and let's talk about what organizational advocacy means, right?
Yeah.
Because you've seen the situation where you have the sponsor may go and so do those that were sponsored by the sponsor.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, you need more than one person, in the room or outside of the room, wherever they may be, truly being an
Yeah.
advocate for you. And so that's
Yeah.
really important. But how does that all work? Because that's
Yeah.
all a part of the career path. And here's
Exactly.
the thing, every organization has uniqueness. Okay. There's no
Yep.
boilerplate. So you got to get in
Yep.
there. I, as an employee, have to ask,
Yep.
and you, as the organization and the leadership, need to tell.
Yeah. And that goes back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier, Francine, about how you have to be very intentional to align the strategy to your culture or how things work in the organization. So the barriers may vary, but if you don't examine what's happening, it's difficult to do so effectively because if you're simply looking at what are other people doing, you may be missing some barriers internally. And, and when you were talking about sponsorship, for example, I've spoken with many women that might be in the pipeline or even high potentials within the organizations that don't necessarily understand. There's a lot of still confusion between sponsor and mentor, and how to find a sponsor. And I know there's a lot of work that was done there a few years ago. And I also heard companies that are trying to, find the best way to uh, uh, facilitate sponsorship, but because it's based so much on relationships and on
Sure.
trust, and people tend to sponsor those that are kind of like them. So it can be very challenging.
Yes, it can be very challenging, but really, and I just read an article in Fortune magazine that I commented on in LinkedIn that, was made about, the fact that it's tough to find Black talent. And
Yeah.
I'm definitely in the corner of saying it is not. I underscore it is not. We're not looking maybe in the right places. And guess what? We're not looking in our organization because there's always someone of color. There's always in the organizations that we are in. And so
Mm.
it's a matter of, being very focused. Maybe it's a matter of reaching very deep into that organization because you see what we call a leader in the mist, right?
Yeah.
And figuring out how can you accelerate their career. Those are the kind of things. So it's there. We're there.
Yeah.
Okay. Women of color, we're there. We may just not be in the right room. And when I say being in the right room or being in the right place, I mean being in those leadership roles. We know what the management roles look, the management boards look like in all of the companies we work for. I call it doing the org chart test. It isn't hard to see. So at the end of the day, but how do you really intentionally, back to your point,
Mm-hmm.
Laura, intentionally work on reaching down, reaching across, bringing in? That's what the strategy needs to be. And at the end of the day, what an amazing time to do this. And oh, by the way, I see lots of D&I roles. Every time I open up, every time I open up my LinkedIn, or I'm looking, out there, I see someone that's being promoted. And guess what? They all, a majority, a great deal of them happen to be Black women, happen to be
Mm-hmm.
women of color. And so you found us. You found us.
For the DI
So
role.
for the DI role, so note to self, you can find us for that P&L role. You can find us for that controller role. No excuses.
Mm-hmm.
I may be a little tough about it, but I don't, I'm not going to give organizations a pass on that.
Yeah, and we're gonna discuss, but it is part of career, opportunities and career pathing. And you're right, if you are gonna take people of color away from business P&L role to put them in D&I, then make sure that there's either a path back,
Oh yeah,
or that that role has a future. Maybe
correct.
that's one better way. Yeah.
Oh, that's a whole nother discussion.
Oh yes,
Yeah,
yes, we
that's
could
a
have a different
whole nother
podcast on that,
discussion.
right? Okay.
I'll come
So and
I'll
and
come back
definitely, I
on
see.
that one. I'll come back.
Yes, yes. When we talk about Diana leader, and I definitely looking at the time, and as usual, when we get into a
Yeah.
conversation, time goes fast. So we actually have, and our fourth poll questions is about the barriers for women of color advancement. So of course you have to pick one if you can. Role models, mentors, or sponsors, not being in the know, visibility, bias and stereotypes,
Mhm.
and all of the above and more. So this is in your organization what's the most challenging barrier that women of color may face, and we'll discuss. And I see that last option
Wow.
is
There's
building on.
someone said I just can't pick because there's a lot.
Exactly. I added that on purpose, but it's not a research. It's more for a way to engaging. So I suspected that many may pick then that up. So let's give a couple of more seconds, and we can close it in a second. Three, two, one. I guess people are still polling. Here we go.
Wow.
So yes, Francine, about 50% cannot pick one. They think they're all important.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, this is what we're talking about: the mentors, the sponsors, the role models, the visibility with senior leaders. I mean, this
Definitely.
is, bias and stereotypes that still exists. That's
Yeah.
why we're talking about this as well. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it's so all of these are connected, right? So one of
Yes.
the reasons why it's difficult to pick is because the limited visibility leads to lack of mentors and sponsors, not being in the know. So they're all connected, but it's good sometimes to think about when you're thinking of tactics, where do we start? And
Mhm.
sometimes, understanding where the main barrier is can be helpful.
Correct, correct.
So
Yes.
if we close the poll, we are going to discuss now the role of leaders.
Hmm.
And we've already touched upon this a bit, Francine. And you already talked about how sometimes you do need to look for the specific and unique barriers that impact different groups differently, including, Black women, brown women, and compared to other groups, and but
Hmm.
also make sure that all leaders are engaged.
Yeah,
So this is
absolutely.
something, yeah, we already discussed to some extent.
Yeah, but it was very telling, just back to your poll, that lack of visibility, right? So
Yeah.
that was very telling about what can leaders do, what can leaders, executives, do to increase their visibility, right?
Mhm.
And to make sure on the other end that you are, asking the question of those women, women of color that are in your workplace, and saying, have you had the opportunity, or we, as conduits in some of the roles that we're in, may have the opportunity excuse me, to really create that
Mhm.
connection, right? Being that person, creating the opportunity for that leader to be in that room, or to be
Mhm.
connected with the other individual that they think is important, that they should know or have visibility to.
Yeah.
There's ways to do that and be very strategic and focused on it.
Definitely, definitely. And I've seen just, there's been a great discussion going on in the background, not specific questions, just interactions among participants, so it's great, but I see a comment about how if senior leaders don't understand inclusion and belonging, microaggressions is very difficult. And it makes sense. And that's one of the challenges. That's why inclusive leadership is such an important skills to integrate.
Hmm.
But it's also accountability, right? So if leaders
Hmm.
are held accountable for not being inclusive, if they're responsible for leading in a way same to any other leadership skills, and this is one of the one leadership skills where they're held accountable, then there might be more incentive to learn and do better.
Yeah, and I would
I don't know.
add, I'm sorry, Laura.
No, I'm done. I'm done.
No, and I would add, beyond, helping leaders, it always amazes me. So when, an organization has metrics that are tied to a business outcome, it's amazing how that particular initiative, that particular body of work, or whatever that is happening in the organization, can happen flawlessly. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because there's, metrics that are tied to it. There's
Yep.
dollars that are tied to it. There's compensation tied to it. There's those
Yep.
stock options, that restricted stock, all that stuff kind of gets tied into that. And guess what?
Yep.
You start to see some movement. And so, in the ideal world, I would love to think out of the goodness of, who you are, and it's the right thing to do, that you're going to do this as a leader in the organization. But sometimes you have to have a little extra on that as well. And I
Yep.
think that that is really important to do, because when you start to hold people accountable with the metrics, you start to drive
Yep.
different behaviors. Okay.
Yes.
And so, not out of this is not goodwill. And we've gotten
Mm-hmm.
past the discussion around this being a business imperative. Let me create the
Yep.
business case for diversity and inclusion, why you need more women in the workplace, more women of color. I think organizations are past that.
Yep.
I was talking about
I
this,
hope so. Yep.
2 decades ago. So
Yes.
anyway, I think there's a clear opportunity to figure out how
I
to
agree.
engage.
Yes. Yes. And it's um, just confirming, and I saw there's a couple of questions that we address in a second, but I agree. And there's also a report that we're working on actually now about measuring these elements. So the same that you would measure if you have a new initiative, a business initiative, and you want to see how they are doing. I think there's in many organizations are not necessarily tracking how their initiative DNI initiatives are doing. They're just sort of there. How are they, what are some of the metrics, and how can you integrate those metrics into business metrics? And so I'll just, put it out there that we're conducting this study if people want to participate in this survey. But I think that that's another area of opportunity here. Make it measurable, integrate it, align it with the business, and that will lead to, as you said, to more effective integration as well.
And really pulling it down and mimicking that at the lowest level in the organization, right? So it's good. I've seen those, on high metrics, as we call them, on
Yep.
high deliverables and goals. And so, the onus is for those individuals in the room that are being, we have the accountability for driving that, is to really be reflective and say, well, how does that apply to my function or to
Yep.
my team or to what I need to do? Because, as much as it goes down, it's got to bubble back up. And so,
Yep.
how do you really push that down? And what does it really look like at the lowest level in the organization? That's when you
Yeah.
know and you can start seeing the results that things are working as appropriate.
Yeah, that's great insight, thanks, Francine. And I see in the interest of time, I want to get us to the last point, and then we have some time to answer a couple of questions that I've seen come in.
Mhm.
And this is a great quote from one of the women you'll be working with. So I let you kind of comment on this, but this is again looking at sort of summarizing what we've been talking about.
Sure. Well, it just comes down to, and you're right, Laura. This was just me speaking with one of the women at one of my summit, actually, that's coming up next month. So this is very timely. But she said, "Listen, Francine," she said, "the only thing I want to know," she said, "I just want to know where I stand, right? And if I'm not a fit in this organization, and I know there's a certain tone when you talk about people being a fit." But she said, if
Mm-hmm.
I don't belong, if I'm not a fit, then just let me know. She's like, please, don't let me make the decision on my own. And
Mm-hmm.
so, we talked about many different things. And, as you see here on the slide, I talked about really, do you understand the barriers that you're up against? And this is something that I feel very passionate about. And I'm actually working, on a book around this, is around the unwritten rules and the unspoken skills. And that's what I call them. They're rules in the organization that nobody knows, but when you cross the barrier.
Mm-hmm.
They're unspoken skills that aren't on a competency, in a competency packet, or you're assessed against them as an employee. But if you don't demonstrate them, then that doesn't position you to be a leader. If you don't master them, it doesn't position you, or you're not viewed to be a leader or future
Mm-hmm.
executive, etc. So these are the things that individuals just want to know. Women of color want to know. It's very important that we have leaders engage and be engaged during pivotal career moments, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you've gotten that big job, it's not okay, and I often talk to leaders in the organizations that I work with around, great that you've given, Francine, this amazing opportunity. Now, how are you going to ensure that she's successful? Where's her safety net? When you send her out there to this remote location called Warsaw, Indiana, that I was at, what is the safety net? Where's the safety net? Where is she coming? She's going to drive up. She's going to work really hard, do a great job. But who's going to help her? Because she just had a pivotal career moment. She just
Mm-hmm.
became a vice president in the company that she worked for. So, what are you going to do to ensure that she's successful?
Mm-hmm.
So, those are the
Yeah,
things that are important. And more,
definitely.
and the last one is just really around having those difficult conversations. Because guess what? It may not work out. Okay. It may
Yeah.
not work out for them as the organization. And more importantly, it may not work out for you.
Yeah.
And so that goes
Yeah.
back to that woman when I was standing there talking to her, and she said, "I just want to know where I stand." This is really simple for me, Francine. It was a powerful conversation, but that helps you understand where you stand. And also, it helps the organization not have to go through the agita of it not working out on both ends. That's what you don't
Definitely.
want.
And somebody earlier actually had a comment about this in the chat, about why it is important to give leaders skills to be vulnerable and have difficult conversations. If you're not able to do that,
Mhm.
um, you know, it the results are that you may be missing on these opportunities.
Absolutely, absolutely. Definitely
Yeah.
an opportunity.
Yeah. Great. And we have just the very last poll questions, and this is about diversity, equity, and inclusion more in general. So we're sort of stepping back to your general strategy. Which of the following is the most important way your organization is helping your D&I leaders succeed at driving change? So again, if you don't have any DEI leader that the DEI sponsor, it may not be sure if you're helping yet. They have a fancy job titles, just put some fancy, funny options in there. But but sometimes that's all it is, yeah. Unfortunately. Okay. And some of it has to do with having a voice, sure. With the ability to really have influence across business and functions, reporting to the CEO, having the right resources to get the job done. So I see again that we have there's not yet a category that stands out more than others yet, so we're going to give it a few more minutes.
And I'm glad to see that one of the answers is around, having a seat at the leadership table, yep. And having also the power to make change, because we know, you can have a seat at the table and yep. have no power, right? Yep. And so I'm watching that trend.
Yeah. That's actually so we can close, yeah. And I think it looks like most people have answered. Mm-hmm. And yes, no, you're right that there's that is a good number to have, and there's a lot of different ways that people. This is of course not an inclusive list, but it's such an important. It's not just having the seat at the table, but actually be able to have influence.
Yes. And can I add another thing?
Of course.
The pay, the compensation, yes. Right? Because, and I say that in all seriousness, because, I put an article out there in LinkedIn. I'm always reading. So I'm always reading, and, I'm always commenting on top of someone else's article, mm-hmm. Right? And one of the things I talked about was that, and I think it was from, I can't remember what news source, but it was really about the fact that we yep. are having a groundswell of DE&I leaders, and they're getting great titles, right? But the compensation isn't necessarily equated to the title. And more importantly, yes, more importantly, they're at the table, but are they being compensated equitably with the other individuals that are at the table in terms of, what they're being asked to accomplish? And so it's a big job. And as I said yeah. earlier, this is one in which we tend to see a great deal of women of color, specifically Black women.
Yep.
Right. So mm-hmm. whole nother discussion yep. around the yeah, potential definitely. Disparities, equity, and all
and
that.
And the next, definitely, if we close the slide, actually, the last slide before we get to the Q&A speaks a little bit to this. So. Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, and if you happen, I know, I read that article that you shared, Francine. So if you happen to have it handy, if you want to share it in the comment box for others, because I remember it was very telling article and very relevant. But so you and I, had this discussion. I said, okay, so how do you make sure that DI leaders and functions are given the opportunity to really make real change? And it goes back to mm-hmm. a little bit the beginning. So, it's a cycle. It's the same principle. It's just a question of being able to implement them effectively. So integrate them across the business, mm-hmm. engage them in both strategies and execution, and make sure that they're given the ability to influence others. So it's not just the one person that is struggling to do so.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, just even something that's very important, and I'll be transparent here. When I was, leading organizations on the HR side, I didn't think about my D&I at the time leader. I didn't think about bringing them into the conversation with my business leader and his leaders to talk about the talent management strategy. I didn't think about when we were doing the succession planning work that I needed to have that lens in the room. And so now, so many things have transpired, and we've become a little bit more sophisticated in that space. That's really when that you're truly integrated into the organization, that you are not a separate, it's not a separate strategy, but it is, and not that it's just a strategy in which you see it on paper, but it's actually practiced in action. right?
Yeah.
And so when you're sitting there having those robust discussions, where is that chief of diversity officer? Where is that D&I function or team when you're getting ready for your talent management, roll ups or whatever you're doing in the organization should definitely be woven into that. So,
Yeah.
huge, huge task, but but important, obviously, but
Yes.
really needs to be integrated and woven into everything, is my perspective, that
Yeah,
role.
and as you said earlier, all leaders have to participate. So yes,
Oh,
you may have
yes.
an allocated function, but every part of the business should be
Yeah,
part of the, yeah, participating.
absolutely.
Thank you so much, Francine. And I see, we have 4 minutes, and we actually didn't get a lot of questions. We have just a couple that we're going to address. So if any of you, we have a few minutes for questions to Francine, and specifically if you have, I did see one about, let's see, I'm recruiting um, for a COO to work in a nonprofit. Any suggestions on how to identify more applicants of color? So this is kind of very practical questions. And you were saying, Francine, that the pool is there. So I don't know if you have any thoughts or suggestions on where to start. Not only for this particular person, but in general.
Yeah.
And then again, I would encourage, in the next few minutes, if you have specific questions, feel free to type them in the chat. Go ahead, Francine.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, if there's an opportunity if there may be someone in your organization that you see that may be one job away, but you can help accelerate that person by giving them the right support structure to be
Mm-hmm.
effective in that role. So sometimes it's so easy to leave the organization that you're in and go to I take nothing from, executive search firms and things like that to find, because that's like an executive role, but there may be someone that you want to take a risk on, and you
Mm-hmm.
want to, or not just take a risk on, but it's someone that you see that with the right development and the support, you can help accelerate them, knowing and helping them understand what they're walking into, and the organization also knowing what they're walking into, or signing up to help that person achieve. So that's one way. The second way is, I'm very big on my network, and I'm always out here searching. When I was in my role as an executive in the corporate structure, I tapped on the doors of many of my colleagues and just had conversations across my sector, across my
Yeah.
organization about, do you know? And then again, I often relied on my relationships that I had with search firms to find the right person. And it's not just, you just don't call them up and say, hey, I got this role, but, are there some that you've been working with, or
Yeah.
someone that someone would recommend that you work with that could help you?
Yeah. And a couple of more questions have come in. One about many DI roles being advertised asking for 15 plus years of experience. I believe that was commonly seen 15 years ago in corporate America. I think, I mean, the roles that were there, but maybe not as visible. What do you think? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that that's why you're getting they're wanting that level, I guess, of
Mm-hmm.
tenure in an organization, is because of that the lens and all of all of what's happening and what organizations are experiencing. They want to bring in someone that they feel can actually hit the ground running and bring the tenure and experience into the organization. So that's, and
Yeah,
that's no
that's
different than
great.
when you're bringing in, the CFO, or these
Yeah,
jobs are just as important. Okay. So
yes,
just, it's just as important as your CFO role. It's just as important as your head of regulatory, etc.
yeah,
So I think that's the reason why.
that's great. And thank you so much, Francine, for your time. Really appreciate it. As I said, your experience and expertise and tactics are very helpful. A few other questions have come up, but we only have 1 minute, so maybe what we'll do
Mhm.
is, we'll see if we can respond separately to those questions. Please join us next month for the next Human Capital Watch on AI in leadership and coaching. And so a different topic, but very relevant today as well. And if you have downloaded the deck, you'll see a few other opportunities, including a survey on COVID-19 that is being fielded right now, as well as future events. So please download the deck so that you can register and take part of the survey. And just a quick reminder before I forget that also we have you have a discount to the diversity and inclusion virtual event coming up in November. Francine, thank you so much for your time again, and great to have you here. And thanks for everyone for the very engaging discussion happening on the chat. That I was looking and participating, but I really appreciate everyone's participation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Laura, and thank you to the conference board as well.